I've gone over and over and over the results of this counteroffensive. I talked about it at the UN Security Council. The casualties are devastating. Ukraine hasn't broke the first defense line. You've had over 40,000 people, Ukrainian forces, I mind you, that have been killed. And that's probably an undercount because the just amount of artillery, the amount of people, these forces that Ukraine is sending onto the front line to basically lie on top of Russian mines and bombs and airstrikes and artillery fire. All of this is leading to just massive casualties without any progress whatsoever. So that's where the chaos really resides. And it's starting to come out in the neocon foreign policy establishment media. And I want to focus on the United States today because the United States has probably been the most optimistic of all of the countries. Of course, Europe just follows along, so we can't really say that Europe has an independent mindset and has any kind of opposing viewpoint. So when it comes to NATO, if we just exclude Turkey, if we exclude Hungary, if we exclude some of these countries that sit on the fence politically and do at times challenge the US unipolar order, if we just look at the most enthusiastic countries that have been pushing for this conflict, the United States sits at the top. And the United States has been sending very mixed messages. That's where the chaos is. You have Mark Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying for months now there needs to be diplomacy, while you have Blinken and the so-called diplomats saying that the war needs to continue, and actually many times over saying Ukraine needs to take back territory and we're going to support it doing that, even at times intimating that Crimea is on the table, which Crimea is never on the table. It's a fantasy. But nonetheless, we have many reports coming out. And I want to talk to you about first the Wall Street Journal report. And then I'm going to talk to you about what the Duran had to say about this as well. But the Wall Street Journal says that the U.S. and Ukraine are at odds over the counteroffensive's tactics. Washington is reportedly frustrated with Kiev's resistance to follow its advice in the conflict with Russia. So, I mean, this is news that continues to come out from the U.S. side. So, unnamed American officials are frustrated with Ukraine's reluctance to accept their advice on how to conduct the counteroffensive against Russian forces, the Wall Street Journal reported on August 24th. The newspaper claimed it was not too late for Kiev to follow instructions from Washington and to utilize the training of tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops who have received this training from NATO nations. The outlet noted, however, the two sides are still at odds about how to turn the tables on the Russians before winter sets in. And according to Wall Street Journal, the U.S. believes that the amount of Western military aid sent to Ukraine is enough to breach Russian defenses, although the window of opportunity is closing. We built up this mountain of steel for the counteroffensive. We can't do that again. It doesn't exist. So here you have the admissions. The window is closing. There isn't enough left to give Ukraine in terms of arms shipments, in terms of training, all of it. They have not breached the defensives, but they are claiming, other officials are saying, that it's not too late. They need to utilize their forces, basically throw out more people, throw out tens of thousands more. No acknowledgement here that over 40,000 have been slaughtered in less than 3 months' time. Less than 3 months, over 40,000 Ukrainian forces wiped off the face of the earth. And that does not even include the injured. We're just talking about those who have been killed. So this is not counterinsurgency. This is Kursk, said General Valery Zaluzhny, the top military commander in Ukraine, which he told his U.S. interlocutors according to an unnamed American official. Zaluzhny was referring to a key World War II battle on the Eastern Front in which Soviet troops stopped Nazi forces, which were turning the tables. So that's how Ukraine is viewing this. Again, this is where the chaos is. The United States is mad. The collective West is acknowledging that things aren't going well with the counteroffensive. And then you have Zelensky, Zaluzhny. They're all saying the same thing. They're saying this is just the beginning. We're just getting started. Doesn't seem like really the confidence and the really time is on their side or anything. Success is on nothing is really on Ukraine's side, but yet the fantasy, this illusion of success still haunts Ukraine. So figures in Washington want Zelensky to concentrate Ukrainian forces near the southern city of Tokmak for a push towards the Azov Sea, said the Wall Street Journal. It added that U.S. officials disapprove of Zelensky's focus on the attempt to take Artyomovsk, which is Bakhmut, in the east, which Kiev calls Bakhmut, as I said. The Ukrainian leader who has invested symbolic significance in the settlement, reportedly arguing that recapturing it would boost morale. U.S. officials have long said that Bakhmut has no strategic value, urging a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops before Ukrainian troops were ousted from it in late May. The Wall Street Journal said Kiev has made adjustments in recent weeks by taking a defensive posture. Russia has argued that, Ukraine is being used as cannon fodder as it continues. NATO continues its proxy war, and they claim 43,000 have been killed. So that's the chaos. That's where the chaos resides. It is not, I repeat, the chaos is not on the Russian side. It's not because of Prigozhin or, it's not because they're being attacked daily by Ukrainian drones, right? None of this is causing chaos in Russia. The economic situation is stable. The reality is that the chaos in this conflict is increasingly on Ukraine's side. Arguably, it was from the beginning. Now the bloodshed, now the complete and utter waste of training and armaments, billions upon billions, is too difficult to conceal because now the SHIT has hit the fan. There is nothing left. There's no more options. The options are gone for Ukraine. For me, I'm not a military analyst. It's unclear what will happen when this occurs, when Ukraine runs out of manpower, when Ukraine runs out of artillery, runs out of weaponry. Perhaps the collective West will continue to boost and draw on its reserves and draw on places it doesn't want to. And of course, perhaps Ukraine will find more and more people to fight this conflict on behalf of the collective West. But nonetheless, there is going to be a breaking point. It's just unsure. We're just unsure about when that is. So I want to now show you what the Duran has to say, because now the United States is talking about armistice. They want armistice. And this is ridiculous in many ways, because for me, armistice was what existed. And I'm only going to play a few minutes of this. But armistice is what existed in Ukraine, or supposedly was supposed to exist in 2014-15 during the Minsk Accords. And what happened to the Minsk Accords? They were broken, and they were completely and utterly disrespected. They were violated constantly by the collective West as they pumped Ukraine with weapons for Ukraine's armed forces, rife with neo-Nazis, pumped them full of weapons, and they wreaked havoc on the Donbass. So really an armistice is worthless here, but I'm going to play what the Duran folks have to say about this, because I think their insight, of course, is always poignant. Here we go.
Situation in Ukraine, we can talk about what is happening in Kupiansk, in the town of Sinkovka. We can talk about what is happening in the southern direction. Perhaps you may want to talk about Rabotino and what's going on there. And we have Zelensky traveling around various European countries trying to acquire Gripens, F-16s, S-400s, because he's got a new grain corridor where he says he can get grain to the countries that need it the most, which means the European Union. And then we have, what else do we have? And then we have the collective West media. They're putting out a lot of articles about how the situation on the front with the big counteroffensive looks very grim, even though they continue to tell us that it's a stalemate. It's grim, but it's a stalemate. What are your thoughts? Where should we begin?
Well, let's talk about the situation on the battlefronts. And there's two basic places where things are going on. The first one, and I think the big one, is in the north around Kupiansk. This is a town of about 25,000 people, at least before the war. It was the capital of the Russian-controlled territory in Kharkiv region, which the Russians captured in February 2022. They held Kupiansk and neighboring towns like Izium and Balakleya until September last year. And then last year, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in this area, which we both very well remember, in which Ukraine was able to capture these places very quickly over the space of about 2 weeks, though it must be said at the cost of heavy losses and against, nonetheless, relatively light Russian resistance. Well, the Russians are coming back, and they are now apparently, I mean, there's been reports this morning from actual Russian officials that a village called Sinkovka has now been cleared of Ukrainian troops. They seem to be advancing on another place called Petropavlovka. Both of these, properly speaking, look like being sort of villages connected to Kupiansk itself. You might call them suburbs of Kupiansk. Ukrainians are trying to rush reinforcements to the area. However, it seems the bridges, Kupiansk is on 2 sides of a small river, which is the Oskol River. The Ukrainians seem to be destroying the bridges that link the eastern part of Kupiansk on the east bank of the Oskol River from the west bank. That suggests to me that they are considering now surrendering the eastern part of Kupiansk. And of course, if they do surrender the eastern part of Kupiansk, then they have lost part of their gains from the autumn offensive of last year, which is their one big victory, if you like, in this war up to now. And of course, we don't know how far the Russians intend to push, how important this offensive is for them, what the Russians ultimately intend to do. But this is an important battle, and Ukraine seems to be losing it.
So that's the battlefield situation. And of course, you heard Pepe Escobar talk about the fact that Russia's potentially going to go on the offensive very soon to even push further. And Pepe Escobar is in Moscow. So, and he travels frequently to Moscow. So he has been talking to sources who said that there may be an offensive from Russia coming at an even more intense level than what Russia's doing right now as it steamrolls this counteroffensive. But I want to fast forward now to the conversation on the ceasefire. So here we go. It's going to start right here at 21 minutes. So let's begin.
What is the negotiation strategy outside of the freezing? I mean, is there anything else that you can see them working towards? I mean, we've talked about West Germany, we've talked about the Korean idea, freezing the conflict along those lines, but obviously that's not going to happen. Is there a plan B or C that they could try to implement in order to get the Russians to go along with some sort of ceasefire?
The only thing they can do if this doesn't work, and as I said, this is a bluff that the Russians are certain to call. The only other thing that they can do, because I think further military escalation by the United States, they're coming around to the view that would be very dangerous, not just dangerous in terms of military consequences, but politically very dangerous for them in the United States. American opinion, public opinion, is now turning against the war. I mean, we now see significant majorities amongst Americans saying that the US has done enough to help Ukraine. It shouldn't be doing even more than what it is doing. So I think they understand that they've gone as far as they reasonably can in what they've provided to Ukraine. So the only thing I think that they can realistically do is try to win over more countries around the world to pressure the Russians to try to agree to this ceasefire and to a peace on these terms. So there's going to be a diplomatic initiative, more attempts, like the Jeddah conference, to get the Indians, the Chinese and other people on side. Difficult to see what they can offer to the Indians and the Chinese and all these other people. But anyway, that's most likely what we're going to see. Threats, bluffs, They're not going to work. I think the Russians can see through them. But the one thing that the administration is absolutely not prepared to do, and I think this is for them a red line. I mean, whatever happens, even at the risk of losing the election, the one thing they're not prepared to do, are not able to do, is to discuss the things that really concern the Russians, which are Russia's core concerns about Ukraine's membership of NATO and about the general security picture in Europe. Some European leaders might be willing to discuss that. The Austrian Chancellor has said that, we do need to think about the security situation in Europe. We have to talk to the Russians about it. But I think the current administration, with its flock of neocons, will never agree to that.
So that's grim. That's grim. That's the situation. There's chaos. That's chaotic, right? The definition of chaos is instability, not having a stable direction, not taking steps forward or actions in a manner that's stable, that really gets things out of homeostasis, out of equilibrium. That is what U.S. policy in Ukraine is right now. That's what collective West policy in Ukraine, neocon foreign policy in Ukraine. It is unstable. So you have both this desire to freeze the conflict, but absolutely no ability or capacity to do what it takes to actually get to some kind of settlement, which would do that. There's no reason why Russia would just freeze the conflict for the United States or for NATO. Why would it? When it is making gains, when it has the advantage at all levels of the conflict, from manpower to weaponry, all of it, it has the advantages. It is not being damaged internally, externally by this conflict. Actually, power has consolidated in Russia, and you could argue that stability is even bigger now. So that is the reality of the situation, that there is no reason why Russia would have to freeze the conflict, especially if the United States and NATO are not in any position to give anything to Russia. And this whole idea that that Russia itself would even accept any kind of terms that had been floated by, let's say, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, saying that, oh, well, maybe Ukraine can just agree to giving up the territory that it has given up in place of NATO membership. That's Russia's number one concern. The territory is a foregone conclusion. Russia's not going to lose that territory. So why would it care about concessions of that territory? It doesn't care if Ukraine acknowledges it or not. Ukraine has shown that it ideologically, politically, militarily, that it doesn't acknowledge it. And even if it were written down on a piece of paper in Minsk Accord fashion, what weight would it really carry? The United States and NATO have shown themselves to be both unwilling, unprepared, and really just uninterested in reeling in its puppet, reeling in its proxy, Ukraine. So Russia, number one, will not give up its number one concern, which is NATO membership for Ukraine, in place of concessions. Number two, the United States is not, as the Duran folks, as Alexander McCurry said, they're not in a position to give up anything. So really, it's just empty words. And these empty words are looking more and more like chaos, looking more and more like instability. And all of these, endless mainstream media stories painting Russia as the basket case, as the, hovel country, the stagnant economy that is just a gas station. All of these articles written, there's hundreds of them, I'm sure we could find all across the collective West media, saying Russia is this, Russia is that, Russia is weak, Russia is unstable, Russia is about to collapse. All of them have been proven wrong. And now the longer and longer that this conflict drags on, the more and more it looks like it's the United States and it's NATO that is in a state of chaos, that is in complete disarray, that doesn't have unity that Joe Biden likes to claim NATO has. NATO unity, European unity. It's not really there. There are so many anonymous so-called officials. There's so many different messages coming out from them, coming out of these sources, coming out also from the White House versus Europe, versus Ukraine. Ukraine had to pass in parliament. They felt so threatened by Jens Stoltenberg's words that they passed a whole resolution saying they would never concede territory to Russia, and that in fact they added stipulations that once Ukraine wins, they will deport all the Russians from the territories in Ukraine, or what was once Ukraine. They will deport every Russian from Zaporozhye, from Crimea, etc. Which basically means this isn't traditional colonial doublespeak, anti-colonial doublespeak. This isn't some kind of war of liberation. There are many Russians who already lived in these regions. There is more integration between Russia Federation as it is now in Ukraine because of the Soviet era, because of hundreds upon hundreds of years of history. It is not the same. It is not France colonizing Niger, for example, settling in Niger, Haiti, wherever. It's not the same thing. We're talking about something completely different, and we're talking about Ukraine advocating for mass expulsion, displacement, really what would amount to genocide, which is what Ukraine was committing and conducting before Russia stepped in for those 8 years. So ethnic cleansing, that's what it was. So that's what we have here. We have instability. We have chaos. The United States is not prepared to give anything on the side of Russia in order to freeze this conflict. So really, it's all a dream. But it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. How does it end? I think that's why most people who follow geopolitics, who are following world events, focus so much on this. It's not that we love Ukraine. Certainly, this topic gets a lot of coverage, but there's so much misinformation about it. There's also a lot of censorship around it. But also, there is this intrigue, not because it's some kind of fun true crime novel. Actually, what it is a major flashpoint in what is the geopolitical seismic waves crashing and splitting and shaking this world order. And what happens in Ukraine is difficult to predict. We can only say what we know is that Russia is winning. Russia was the one that has turned the so-called tide, although you could say Russia always had the advantage from the beginning. It's right in its territory. It's a big military power. Already had a relatively stable economy, growing economy. Now it's growing to a degree probably unheard of given the thousands of sanctions against it. So Russia already had the advantage from the beginning, but the United States and NATO went all in. They threw everything they had at Ukraine, and everything they had wasn't enough. And now the murmurs of dissatisfaction, of the counteroffensive not going well, of freezing the conflict, all of it points to a realization, if not a realization, just a delayed recognition of what the issue, what the outcome was always going to be. And that is Russia was going to win. Russia was going to win this. It wasn't a conflict to be won. But the interest of the military-industrial complex, the interest of unipolarism, of U.S. hegemony, of needing to be the empire on top, of needing to control and dominate the planet at the behest of the big banks, of the big corporations, these interests supersede realpolitik. They just do. And that is what is on full display right now. Full display as we see the divisions come out, as we see the disagreements, as we see Ukraine sparring with the collective West, which kind of goes against this ironclad unity that we heard so much about that has arguably been myth from the beginning. I mean, you had Zelensky chastise Congress. This was a long time ago. This was during the first iteration of sending more NATO aid after Ukraine ran out of everything following its first so-called offensive back in summer of 2022, right? So you had Zelensky from the beginning, and Zaluzhny, and all of these top Ukrainian officials in the military side say, we don't have enough, we don't have enough, we don't have enough. They'll never have enough. There's not going to be enough. There's not going to be a victory. What we're going to see is the continued instability, the continued chaos that comes from this conflict, that comes from massive losses and casualties, that comes from manpower, from soldiers, from all of these forces, Ukrainian forces being decimated time and time again, day after day after day. That's what we're going to see. Well, of course, we'll see the shockwaves too. We'll see the global shockwaves, the multipolar world continue to cement itself as Ukraine exposes these fissures and exposes the fact that the collective West and the United States at its head is ultimately organized to wage war on humanity. That is what is going to continue to be exposed by this. That's what is going to happen. That's all we can really predict. A ceasefire, a frozen conflict, all of this seems well out of the question. The more likely outcome is some kind of Russian victory. But what kind of victory will be allowed? Because the collective West cannot cede victory. They're not prepared to give anything to Russia. How can they spin this? How can they make this work for them? The dangerous side of this is that how they make it work for them is escalating further and making it so they find other ways to weaken Russia, or maybe, just maybe, they find a way to justify outright confrontation. There's only some forces within Washington, within the neocon foreign policy establishment, that would accept such an outcome. But the fact that it even is on the table, which it is for some, it's not everybody. And at this point in the conflict, we can say for sure that it's not everybody. Everybody wants war within the foreign policy establishment with Russia. They don't necessarily want to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, given how things have transpired over the last several years. However, it does not mean it's not possible. So the fact that there's an open conflict, there's an open debate and divide, spells two things for us. It means, number one, the dangers are only going to grow. Number two, it means the opportunities are also going to grow for both Russian victory and also for peace forces, people who are truly genuine in peace, for peace and for justice with peace, can grab leverage, can begin to build leverage, build political power. That's really the mission, I think, of people in the collective West as public opinion begins to dissolve and decline around this conflict is, can we mobilize? Can we organize? Can we be a force that helps bring about an end to this conflict in a manner that supports the multipolar world, self-determination, Russia's security interests, and of course the interests of humanity, which, if you read between the lines and you're not a full-on neocon or Cold War propagandist, McCarthyite, whatever, you can see that Russia's security interests are actually in the interests of humanity. Ukraine and NATO is a disaster. The militarization of Ukraine is a disaster. Ultimately, the militarization of the world by the US and NATO is a disaster for all of us outside of a very small percentage of the elite. That is the truth. That is the truth we need to spread far and wide. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.